The first presenter will be Dr. Thomas O'Donnell. His presentation will be connected with energy power and evolving concept of war. And of course, everything about our distinguished colleague is inside of our materials. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis. And I just have to, one second, pointer. I just have to very briefly say it's a great honor to be here as an American, to be invited to the Balkans, and as someone also who lives in Germany for a number of years. Hopefully I have figured out something about how the EU works. That's what I want to talk to you about, the problems. So you can see here, what I originally wanted to talk about, I was deindustrialization. I decided this is too broad. So I want to do narrow it somewhat. And what I want to tell you about is a subsidiary question that's driving deindustrialization, and that is what I would say is the errors in energy policy and infrastructure building in the European Union. That is to say, in the Green Deal. If you recall, it was actually a full year before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Russians were actually preparing to weaponize gas deliveries. Europe was very dependent on gas. And it wasn't noticed by the Commission probably for at least half a year. And in the end, this was a terrible crisis for Europe. It was over-dependent on Russian gas imports. That also has to do with the Green Deal, actually, in certain ways. And this was a terrible crisis. And I won't go through it all, but as we know, basically you can say that the EU won. We got through it. We didn't have to surrender and give up support for Ukraine and so forth, which Putin had intended, and got through it. But what I want to warn about is that I would say, first of all, the war is still going on. It's not over with. The energy crisis continues in Europe. And the thing is, the way it's going, it's turning out to be a Pyrrhic victory. So the victory is being turned into defeat if the EU doesn't reform certain key things. And that's essentially what I want to go through today. So there's two aspects. Two pillars, I would say. There were two pillars to the European policy before the war. And I won't go through this completely, but you can see with oil is the universal basis of transport. 93% of everything that moves in the world runs on oil, okay? And the idea is that the EU is legislating that oil will no longer be the basis of transport, that they're going to have electric vehicles. I don't see the technical basis to make that decision at this point. That could happen. I think it's very doubtful, and there's big problems with this. In any case, this dependence, when the Druzhba pipeline went off, this caused lots of trouble in Eastern Europe in particular, we know about. In coal, similar things. It was decided to phase out coal, and that made gas more geostrategic. And the problem is, because of the goals of the Green Deal, or the way of looking at things under the Green Deal, internally there has not been any drilling, very little or no drilling for new gas. The big Russian gas partnership was pursued as an interim thing. And then there was also, after the D-Day was set to phase out for coal, before the full-scale invasion began, the full intention of environmental groups and green parties and many in Europe was to right away set a D-Day for the phase out of gas. After what happened with the crisis, it was realized that this would have looked very bad if they had gone ahead with this, okay? So anyway, now we come to the Green Deal. The Green Deal is really based, the model for the Green Deal is I would say is the German Energiewende model, the German transition, and this is pretty straightforward. It's for 100% renewables, no fossil or nuclear. And the idea here, the proposal is that an entire industrial state can run on 100% domestic renewable energy. Now, I would just point out the German government no longer believes this. Some people do, but the 8th monitoring report of the Energiewende, which is an official outside experts who review it for the parliament, for the Bundestag, in 2021 said it's not possible. And that's why they're pursuing the import of green electricity and green hydrogen from all over the world. And this policy has been taken up also in the European Union. So there's ideological and populist, I would say, is the origins. I'll go through the history of this a little bit, is where it came from. It didn't come from tech and scientific expertise. And as problems have evolved, I would say it's not the involvement of technical and scientific experts that's determined the constant advance. One of the main assertions, if you'll remember, especially before the war flared up, was that all the tech exists. The problem is that there's a lack of political will. And all the protests and the pressure, with both from certain politicians but also from below, had this as their motto. Because after all, wind and solar are now very cheap. What's the problem? It's just the big companies or whatever. So this is completely false. I just want to look at the history of this a little bit. The father of all these renewable models was a fellow named Amory Lovins. He divided the world in the 1970s into hard energy paths versus soft energy paths. The hard paths were coal, natural gas, oil, and nuclear. Now why? Why did he want this? There was very many things said, if you'll remember, and they don't say these things anymore, but it was the basis. They've been given up. Fossil and nuclear require large corporations, and it was trying how to get rid of large corporations. It was very straightforward up until a few years ago. There was also a misinterpretation of the 1970s energy crisis and later thinking that we had hit peak fossil fuels. But everybody knows that now that's obviously ridiculous. There's plenty of fossil fuels and very cheap in the world. And there was legitimate worry about environmental pollution. There were arguments about zero limits to growth, which have all collapsed, neo-Malthusian ideas that did not come true. And there was also this idea that we could have energy democracy with soft energy paths, with renewables, small smart grids, we wouldn't be foreign dependent, and so forth. And it was only later that the idea of this could help with, renewables could help with global warming. That came later. This was before, okay? So this is kind of interesting. But it boosted it, obviously. So here's the things that were supposed to come with this in the model. Small, smart, democratic grids run by local communities will manage demand to match supply, and we'll have wind and solar, depending on where you live. We also will have energy efficiency. We're going to reduce this, and there's a lot of talk that capitalism is always for, cowboy capitalism. It always has to grow. Many of the believers in this, and many times the Green program was for zero growth. And the other thing is, it was said very clearly by Lovins and others way back 50 years ago, of course, wind is variable. Solar is variable. We're going to need grid-scale, long-term energy storage. Okay, so the idea was you over-install it, and you take the extra on windy and sunny days and store it for the days when you don't have it. That was the idea. What are the model's tech problems? That's what I want to raise. This was all a techno-optimist revolution, okay? It was, in the sense, it wasn't completely a Luddite thing. And the idea was not to change capitalism or not to change society based on a directly political path, but on a technological path. By changing the energy, we could change society. And so I think if we should put aside right now in the European Union and other places, whether the Green Deal comes from the left or the right, and just look at the technology. What are the tech problems? And get away from this. Is the Green Deal model technically possible? So, so what's actually happened is there's been failures, and I'm just going to go very quickly. The failures in this model, in the sense that small smart grids and energy democracy completely failed. The Green parties don't talk about this anymore, because they don't have a solution to this variability. They say, well, we have to connect them all so that there's some place in Europe it'll be very windy and sunny, and we can borrow the extra from there and bring it to where it's not. So we have to interconnect everything in one big market, okay? That's the answer to that. And they're doing this. They're building these long interconnectors, although it's very expensive and it's not going anywhere according to plan. The other really key thing is there is no universal long-term grid scale storage. It's been 40 plus years. I'm a nuclear physicist. A lot of colleagues quit and went to work for all sorts of companies in the States, and it didn't work. I could go through all the different technologies. Everybody talks about batteries. Batteries work 40 minutes, right? If there's no sun, and 40 minutes, maybe an hour, but that's it. 93% of all that exists is grid-scale storage, is pumped hydro, which is great. It's extremely expensive, but from Paris to Moscow, it's what the military guys call the Great Northern Plain. It's not going to work, okay? So they have a problem, and so their solution, and what I'm getting to here is why do we have a gas crisis this year, is natural gas turbines are the de facto universal grid scale storage now. What they are doing, like the leader of the Green Party in Germany, they couldn't form a government without including the Greens, so he became the Minister of Energy and Economics. And I've heard him talk. He first said we have to install 35 to 39 gigawatts, can you imagine, of new gas turbine generation. It's incredible. I mean, anyway, you understand, right? Later he said 25, his ministry said 25, and then he got 12.5 approved. Yes, thank you. But anyway, it hasn't happened because of political turmoil. It's a huge project. Now here's the problem. We have the head of the Green Party installing, all these gigawatts of natural gas. The party's all upset. So what he said to them is, don't worry, it's gas. We can replace this gas with hydrogen, green hydrogen gas later. It won't be wasted infrastructure. Let me just say, I could talk about it if you want. It ain't going to work. This is not a new industry. It's been around for 150 years. We produce this stuff at big refineries. And you can talk to engineers who work on it. They think this is nuts. I don't have time to go into it. But it's not going to happen. And so it's a policy fiasco. It's an infrastructure fiasco. So two parallel systems, one all renewable, one all gas. What caused this year's crisis? Russian gas via Ukraine was shut down, the last bit of it, right? About 5% of what Europe uses. We had 3 years to prepare. However, in late November and early December, there were 3 or more weeks of Dunkelflaute in the north. Dunkelflaute is a German word. It means it was dark and there was no wind. And it was fairly cold. So you can look, I could show you the data. Wind and solar went almost to zero. And gas came up and filled it in, plus importing nuclear electricity from France. Macron yesterday was bragging about how we exported 92 terawatt hours of electricity last year into the rest. It's great for the French, right? So the European Union started the season with a surplus of natural gas. We're going to get through it. The price of natural gas started out twice as high as it was, still twice as high as it was before the Russian crisis. Well, maybe we can get it down. It's gone the other way because they used up all the surplus. Now they're going on the market. They have to out-compete the Asians for bringing LNG in, or they won't have enough next year, and the prices are going up. And it's a crisis. And the leadership in Brussels, this is my last point, I'll stop, is that Mrs. van der Leyen and Teresa Ribera, together with the German government, the Austrians, Spanish, somewhat the Italians, are demanding 5 new huge H2, hydrogen corridors, pipelines from all around Europe in, okay? And they will not sign contracts long-term for natural gas because in 10 years it's not going to be needed. And so they're in this problem. They're stuck in an ideological problem, and there's this crisis. And yes, this is driving deindustrialization, I would say. My last point is, even if you talk to the far right, they don't really understand it. They know something's wrong, but they don't understand it either, even the CDU in Germany, I would say. So it has to be reformed. I could talk to you about what I think needs to be done. But anyway, mass transit and nuclear. Okay, that's the end. Okay.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I know that the topic is so complex that you could lecture here 3 hours at least, but
I went too long.
I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions in the Q&A session, and you put really excellent points to